Hello and welcome back to Miss Hannah Loves Grammar. In this video we'll be unpacking the theme of age across an Inspector Calls by J.B. Priestley. Now Priestley depicts the significance and the divide between generations in the plot of this play. The older generation are Mr. and Mrs. Birling, and they feel no responsibility at all or remorse for the way they treated Eva Smith. The younger generation, however, in the form of Eric and Sheila, their children, accept social responsibility when they're made aware of what they've done wrong, and they want to be different from their parents. Therein lies the major divide. And it's important to note that Gerald, who's technically a member of the younger generation, revels in the potential that the inspector is not real, frankly indulges his belief that he shouldn't need to have social responsibility if he can't be traced. If you like, it's not the act of committing the crime, it's the act of getting caught. So in some ways, Gerald reflects the older generation's principles, or lack thereof. Priestley is undeniably drawing parallels here between socialist leanings, the idea that progress can happen by treating the most vulnerable fairly, and that the youth have the answer, specifically Sheila and Eric, when they learn the errors of their ways. But where does this really fit into the context of why Priestley's writing this play anyway? Perhaps Priestley is highlighting that for society to avoid repeating its same classist divisions, it needs to rely on the future generations, the young, not acting in the same way as their forefathers. Now from Act 1, we encounter Mr. Birling's incredibly dramatic, ironic speech commenting on how unsinkable the Titanic is. And we instantly, as an audience, through our own knowledge, learn to distrust his judgment and his judgment as an elder. He talks about how unlikely it is that there'll be a war as well. We know by the time the audience are sat in the auditorium for the first viewing of this play that 2 world wars have happened since Mr. Birling has made his speech. Now, for Sheila and Eric, their maturity is charted across the play as they become more and more aware of the faults they have and the faults in their own parents' judgment. Now, perhaps Priestley is using all these tools to reinforce to his post-war audience that to improve society there must be a more compassionate attitude to the vulnerable like Eva Smith. In fact, there is no room to be so stuck in societal norms and expectations of old. But where does this leave us? I'm now going to plough through some quotes for you to keep at the forefront of your mind were you to be considering age in any kind of essay or response. Sheila, what an expression, really the things you girls pick up these days. Now this is, bear in mind, Act 1, so Sheila is celebrating her engagement to Gerald Croft. Yet here she's being infantilised and spoken down to in a rather patronising manner by her mother. This is exacerbated by Priestley's persistent use of exclamation marks. We know whoever would be acting as Mrs. Birling would be really emphatic in their exclamation for each of these particular short staccato expressions. Mrs. Birling is showing her snobbish attitude here by implying that she is looking down upon her child. If you can't manage your language, my dear, what else can you not manage? We also get the impression that Mrs. Birling's character is fixated on her role as a powerful figure, as an elder and a mother. And whilst this is in keeping with her role in Edwardian times as a rather wealthy woman, she seems dominant and overbearing. And we even get that at the start of this play. She's even overbearing to the extent with her own husband. But this video is on age, so I shall move on. It's important to consider that critiquing Sheila's speech in the way she does and her actions is partially not just condemning Sheila, but the whole generation. When she says, "you girls, these days," there's quite a callous broad stroke being used by Mrs. Birling here to say that they're all the same. What's important to note here is that Sheila is quite placid in response to her mother in Act 1. This does not sustain, though, as we move on to this particular moment in Act 2. "You're beginning to behave like a hysterical child tonight." So Mrs. Birling is maintaining her power-driven matriarchal role, yet unfortunately her daughter's attitude has changed. She's been shown by the inspector that she has done wrong, and she's beginning to realise her actions were really, really rather despicable with poor old Eva Smith. So here Mrs. Birling is telling her daughter off. She uses the simile, behaving like a hysterical child. which highlights her overbearing tendencies as a parent. The adjective hysterical proves she's disgraced by her daughter's attitude, and she doesn't accept that her daughter has a different opinion. So instead, she infantilises her child again. She uses the noun child, when she knows full well she is her child, but her child is currently an adult. Now, it's important for us to also be aware that for Mrs. Birling to maintain her power, she has to disempower her child or children. She does this consistently throughout the play. She wants compliance, not independence from her daughter. And perhaps that's for her daughter's best interest in the times that she's living in. Deference, not a voice, is what she's expecting. And she doesn't get that from Sheila. And that's a great, significant moment in that conflict between generations that you might want to comment on. We often do on the young ones. They're more impressionable. Now here the inspector in Act 2 is highlighting Priestley's agenda. He's sharing that the more malleable younger generation are the ones who have the future in their hands to shape society more positively. It's a compliment when he says they're more impressionable. Impressionable is often seen as being vulnerable, innocent, naive. Here, more impressionable implies it's the older generation who should be ashamed. It's insulting to the older generation that they can't change their views, that they won't see beyond what they know. For a post-war audience, this absorption of Priestley's message would probably be very clear, that they need to behave differently to their elders before them if they want society to improve. And it's very clear across the whole play. The voice of reason in the voice of the inspector unearths the hidden might of the young and echoes socialist priorities that Priestley ardently believes in, which is in direct contrast to the older generation that we encounter across the play, but specifically in Act 2, it's really brought to the boil. Later on in this act, Mrs. Birling says, "So I was perfectly justified in advising my committee not to allow her claim for assistance." What's most pertinent here is the contrast to rational sense. It's such a deep contrast from that of the inspector who we've just heard. Mrs. Birling seems incredibly sanctimonious and entitled, as she uses the adverb perfectly in perfectly justified. Perfectly justified in not helping a pregnant woman who asks for charity, albeit under the name of Mrs. Birling. But that adverb, perfectly, almost seems a bit defensive, which is interesting. It suggests that the inspector and others have struck a nerve for her unfeeling, judgmental side. But it's the fact she's advising, that verb, she's used her power in that way. Priestley is accentuating here that age does not mean wisdom, and Mrs. Birling reflects older generation pride and judgment, and also a crude lack of humanity, which definitely goes against what we learn from the inspector and his hopes for the young. "Why, you hysterical young fool, get back or I'll..." Mr. Birling in Act 3 is echoing his wife's sentiments quite completely here, even mirroring their language with him saying hysterical like she did about Sheila. Now, here he's commenting on Eric's attitude, but both parents, like the older generation they represent, seem to denigrate the young as fools here. Mr. Birling is far more aggressive with Eric than we saw with Mrs. Birling and Sheila. Partly we get this impression from the incomplete sentence, which seems to act as a kind of threat. We don't know what he'll do, but it sounds like it might be violent. But the imperative "get back" is also asserting his power amidst his rage at his son. The dashes also show a guide, if you like, from Priestley to the actor playing Mr. Birling, that he needs to bubble with rage here. And once again, the older generation seem to be willfully abusing their power and manipulative at that too. I wonder though, is Priestley portraying Mr. Birling as just a megalomaniac who wants to have some sort of iron grip on his family? Or is he meant to represent the iron grip of capitalism that will not let go and will judge those who are foolish enough to see the place of the vulnerable as more important than individual gain? Now it's interesting, later on in this same act, Eric's response to his parents' willful dismissal of anything the inspector had to say, and also Gerald, is to say simply, "You're beginning to pretend now that nothing's really happened at all." His accusation is strong. He cannot believe that they would be so short-sighted and is disgusted. But it's important, Priestley chooses not to allow the generations to resolve their differences. He seeks for these generations to be at war with each other. There's no closure for the audience. Age, generational divide remains. And it's clear that any audience walking away from this particular play needs to learn the lessons of the old, who've made mistakes, and be empowered by the lessons learnt from Eric and Sheila, who choose to live differently. Now, it's hard to place Gerald, hence why I haven't fixated on him, but it's important for you to note that while you're commenting on age, he defies his age and acts in a fashion that's much more traditional and in line with the older generation. Maybe it's because he's from old money. Maybe it's because he doesn't want to accept responsibility. But that divide between parents and children is incredibly powerful, and Priestley uses it exactly to play into the hands of his audience, who are desperate for societal change, having watched what happens to that vulnerable girl. Why not subscribe to Miss Hannah Loves Grammar for all things English, literary and grammatical?